Good evening, fourth graders, and welcome to your second flipped lesson on fractions. Tonight's flipped lesson is going to be on adding unlike fractions. So in order to do that, we have to understand what unlike fractions are. Unlike fractions are fractions that have different numbers in the denominator. So if you're looking at two different fractions, both fractions have two different numbers in the denominator. The opposite of an unlike fraction are like fractions. And like fractions have the same number in the denominator. So if I'm looking at two fractions, both fractions have the same number in the denominator. In order to add any two fractions together, those two fractions must be like fractions. So you might be wondering, how are we going to add unlike fractions in this lesson? Well, we're going to take these unlike fractions, the fractions with two different numbers in the denominator, and we're going to turn one of them into a like fraction. We're going to turn one into the same denominator as the other. And we do that by finding one fraction's equivalent fraction. And this is how we do that. When we're finding the equivalent fraction, we have to remember that whatever we do to the numerator, we have to do to the denominator. And whatever we do to the denominator, we have to do to the numerator. For example, if we were trying to change 1/2 to find its equivalent fraction, I would multiply 2 by something. And in this case, I multiplied it by 3. So 2 times 3 gave me 6. And since I multiplied the denominator by 3, I had to multiply the numerator by 3. So it's important to remember that rule whenever you're finding an equivalent fraction. Take some time right now and write this inside your vocabulary section of your notebook. This is very important. You should even draw this diagram to show you what we mean by whatever we do to the denominator, we do to the numerator, and vice versa. Whatever we do to the numerator, we do to the denominator. Let's just go back to when we were in third grade and we added two like fractions. Remember, the like fractions both have the same denominator. So in example number 1, both 8/10 and 1/10 have 10 in the denominator, which make these two fractions like fractions. I drew a bar model to show you what 8/10 would look like and what 1/10 would look like. So this section of my bar is showing you 8 out of 10 pieces shaded. This is showing 1 out of 10 pieces shaded. Because they're like fractions, I could put them on the same fraction bar model. When you're adding like fractions, your denominator always stays the same when you're finding the sum. So if my denominator in both fractions are 10, my denominator in my sum is 10. And now all we do is add the two numbers in the numerator. So 8 plus 1 equals 9. And if I'm looking at my bar model that I drew, I could say that now putting both of these two fractions together will give me 9 out of 10 pieces colored. Let's take a look at the second example. We're still adding like fractions because both fractions have the same number in the denominator. So again, this section of my bar model is showing me 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pieces colored out of a total of 18 pieces. And the blue section is showing me 4 pieces colored out of 18. Since I'm adding these two fractions together, and I know that when I add like fractions, I just keep my denominator the same, I'm going to have 18 as my denominator. So the only two numbers that I'm going to have to add are the numerators. So 6 plus 4 gives me 10. That means if I am adding up all of these colored pieces, that would give me 10 out of 18 pieces colored. That's how we add like fractions. Now we're going to add unlike fractions. When we're adding unlike fractions, we have to make sure that we're turning them into like fractions. And we do that by changing one of the fractions by giving them its equivalent fraction. So the first thing that I do is I look at my fraction and I find the denominator that is smaller. So 2/3 and 1/6. If I'm looking at just the denominator, I notice that the 3 is the smaller denominator. So that's going to be the fraction that I want to change. Because I know that I could make 3 a 6. And I know I can do that by multiplying 3 by a number. So I'm going to show my work down below, and I'm going to write the fraction that I want to change underneath my fraction sentence. So I want to change 2/3, and I want to give it a 6 in the denominator. So I have to multiply my denominator by a certain number in order to get a 6 in my denominator. Since I know my fast multiplication facts, I know that 3 times 2 will give me 6. So whatever I multiply to my denominator, I have to multiply to my numerator. And I multiplied my denominator by 2, so I multiply my numerator by 2. And 2 times 2 will give me 4. So now, instead of using 2/3, I'm going to use the fraction 4/6. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to put one line, kind of a diagonal line, through the fraction that I changed, and I'm going to write the new fraction, the equivalent fraction, up above. And the equivalent fraction is equal to the fraction that I have. So the only way that I changed it was I made it have the same denominator as the other fraction to make them like fractions. Because remember, we can't add unlike fractions. So now I can add 4/6 plus 1/6. And remember, now that they're like fractions, I keep the denominator. So 6, 6. The sum will have a 6 in its denominator. And all I do is I add the numerators. So 4 plus 1 will give me 5. Let's take a look at the second one. So again, the first thing that I do is I find the fraction that has the smaller denominator. And that is 1/2. So I'm going to write that 1/2 down below where I show all my work. And I'm going to ask myself, can I multiply 2 by a number to get 10? I can. So I'm going to multiply 2 times a number, and that will give me 10 in my denominator in my equivalent fraction. 2 times 5 will give me 10. Since I multiplied my denominator by 5, I have to multiply my numerator by 5. And the answer in my equivalent fraction is going to be 5 in the numerator, because 1 times 5 equals 5, and 2 times 5 equals 10. So now 5/10 is my equivalent fraction to 1/2. So 1/2 and 5/10 are equal. They're equivalent fractions. So I'm going to cross out 1/2 because that's an unlike fraction when we're looking at 3/10. 5/10 and 3/10 are like fractions because they both have 10 in the denominator. I'm going to write my new equivalent fraction up top. And now I can add these two like fractions together. So 5/10 plus 3/10. I know that my denominator stays the same since they're like fractions. And all I do is I add my numerators. So 5 plus 3 gives me 8. I think you guys are ready to try a couple on your own. These are the examples that I would like you to try. And I want you to remember the steps. You can't add unlike fractions, so you're going to have to change one of those fractions to make it equivalent, to make it the same. And then you're going to be able to add those two fractions together. Have fun. Remember, pause at any time, go back and rewind, and watch the video if you have any problems. I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.